Hello, Neha.
Hi, Mike. How's it going?
It's going very well, thank you. This is our first time doing a little thing. Neha and I are having a conversation. We were having a conversation recently, and we thought that other people would be interested in what we had to say. So let's do it. So what we're going to do is give our introductions for each other because we thought they'd be more complimentary that way. So Neha was the best manager I've ever had in my career. Uh, we worked together until I left GitHub, I guess like 2 and a bit years ago.
hmm
Neha and I worked together at GitHub for about 3 years. She was at GitHub for 8 years. And yeah, just generally knows everything there is to know about management and motivating teams, and particularly about working very well with staff or principal engineers, which is what I was when we worked together.
Mike already said that we met, and we worked together for 3-ish years. Um, Mike's reputation preceded him at GitHub. I knew him as like the homebrew guy and someone who wasn't afraid to push a few buttons at work. I inherited him, and I found that he became quickly my favorite curmudgeon. But it's not just the GitHub stuff. He's been in open source for 20 years. He's been he's been working in homebrew, I think, for like 16 years or something like that. And he'd been at GitHub before me. And so he kind of knew his way around. We worked really well together because Mike is, while he is not afraid to speak his mind, he's actually incredibly patient. He's kind, and he's willing to work with people who are willing to put in the work themselves. And I feel like those are the qualities of some of my favorite people.
Well, I now regret doing the intro thing because that was way too kind and disgustingly
Well,
nice compared to my description of you.
no
Just
one could see my eye rolls when you were doing my description unless they're watching the video.
there we
So,
go. Wonderful. Well, so something we talked about recently is I think last time we talked, we were chatting about managery stuff. It's interesting because when we worked together, like I had never been a manager at that point, and I was like doing the whole staff engineer thing. I've since been a manager a little bit at my own startup when I was at Workbrew, and then now I'm doing some management stuff as like a fractional CTO. And I wrote a wee post on my blog recently called like minimum viable engineering management, based on like describing to people who might not have done it before, like what I see as the minimum expectations, based on having been at GitHub when there was no managers, and then when there was managers, when there was no expectations. But yeah, when we were talking about this earlier, Neha, you said that there was some stuff from there that you thought might be missing that could be added. So
well, I think we should first, I think it's absolutely fascinating. I think what we're missing here is that, like, Mike, you told me you're like, I never want to be a manager. Like that, I absolutely don't. And then all of a sudden, right, you leave GitHub and you find yourself in a manager position. And so, like, I actually think we should cover some of the things in that blog post because, like, you've created your own definition of like what the table stakes are for management. And like, I feel like I've been in management for way too long to be critical enough about that. And so like, I think you should share like what you think are table stakes for management and what worked for you in order to stay sustainable because you were still coding alongside, right? Like it was a small company and like, shit still needed to get done. So how do you balance that management with the day-to-day work and like do what you think is like minimum viable?
yeah, okay. So I guess why I ended up doing management, I guess, like that was the expectations when I joined the startup would be like
Was the deal.
event. Yeah, so it was sort of the deal from the outside. Well, that was helpful because it was like, okay, well, this is a thing that's going to happen at some point. So I initially was just cranking out code or whatever, and eventually we started hiring some other engineers who weren't me, and it was like, okay, well, I'm going to keep writing code, but also have to manage these people. And I guess my experience with GitHub, positive with you and negative with people who will be unnamed, in the past, like showed me the various extremes of like management and what should be done and shouldn't be done. And I don't know, like I guess I've had experiences or seen people or had people in my network in the past who like were part of a big company and all the management and the HR reporting and blah, blah, blah was like really oppressive and they hated it. And then they're like, when I make my own startup, I'm not going to do any of that. Right. Like, and throw the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. And
hmm
I was like,
hmm
okay, like, how can I not be like really shit as a manager? Right. Cause I'm just being too lazy, but how can I make sure it requires the minimum viable amount of my time, and how can I make sure I'm providing like the minimum viable like services, I guess, to my reportees or team or whatever to make sure that that gets done. And then I guess in both roles that I've had where I've been doing that, and also like what can I potentially offload to other people in the team, be they like formal managers or semi managers or not managers or whatever.
Yeah. And like in this blog post, right, you write about, you know, regular one-on-ones, right? And it's not just about a rundown of everything you've done. It's about getting context and providing context. It's about delivering feedback, and unblocking them. And it's about receiving feedback. But I think what's really interesting about your post is every section that you have in your post is about a question. And that is because having conversations with your reports and working with them is about a dialogue, and it's not about a one-way push of information. And I feel like when people start to think about it as like, hey, I'm coming into this one-on-one, you get on your soapbox for 30 minutes, then you've like lost the plot, and it needs to be about a conversation back and forth.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like I think what I hated being on the other side of that, and I try not to do it because I guess as you know, as you maybe noticed or knew when we worked together, like I had an early reputation in GitHub for being like aggressively anti any meeting, right? Which I I didn't necessarily do a quick job to shed because as a reputation, it's good because it means people are like not frightened would be a strong word, but people are maybe apprehensive to schedule a meeting with you unless it's really important and it can only be done that way. And like
Yeah, you want them to
that
think about it.
exactly.
Think twice.
I like that. I like that then and I like that now. So for me, it's like I think there's a bunch of stuff you can do outside of the one-on-one in terms of like information delivery. And, you know, if I just need to tell someone something, like I'm not going to wait till our one-on-one. I'm going to tell them in Slack or
Right,
an
of
email
course.
or a GitHub comment or whatever. But then also like the other way around as well, like where, you know, I think I maybe mentioned Geekbot in the post. That's just my like Slack stand-up preferred tool of choice. But equally, like I don't think it makes sense to have like a daily meeting with someone where they just tell me what they're doing when they could just
Mm-mm.
write that down in a form that everyone can consume. So yeah, so like that's why for me it's as you say, like around questions and particularly around like difficult conversations, right? Like having face to face video
Yeah,
call, both people with their cameras on, synchronous or in person, like that is something where, yeah, like it's easier to have difficult conversations that way than it is to just like quickly fire off a DM. And yeah, and I guess for me, like two-way feedback delivery is one of the hardest things to do and
yeah,
receive. And like that's the best place to do that, I think.
yeah, yeah. And so I noticed in your post, the one thing that I spend a lot of time on in my one on ones that wasn't mentioned there is establishing connections. And so, one thing that I mean, I'm thinking about this from two perspectives, but you know, w- uh, in the case, which was at GitHub, that I often had a greater sense of like what the actual org chart was, like the shadow org chart of how things work. I could kind of put some pieces together and say, like, okay, cool. If you're blocked on this, you should talk to this other person. Or I have a feeling that things are going to change in this certain area and like you should go make friends and you want to make friends now before things hit the uh become conflicted. I'm going to use appropriate language here. I don't know what the line is for a podcast
I've
yet.
sworn
Uh,
already, so you can swear. We've already got the explicit tag.
yeah, when shit hits the fan, right?
There we go.
And so uh, I think it's really important to establish connections. It's also great as a manager because then I'm not the in between, right? So I'm trying to think, okay, cool. Who does Mike need to talk to so that they can resolve their shit on their own and like not go through me? And it's all about like knowing who the influencers are and who are the blockers and also not the influencers of today, but I'm trying to think about what this company is going to look like in 2 years, in 3 years, and who the top contenders are. And I'm not just going to be like, Mike, here's like my play by play, and here's like my brackets, and here's who I think is going to win. I have to tailor that to the individual. So I'm going to say, hey, Mike, like, if you're working in this area, you might want to go reach out and make connections with these people and establishing those connections. I don't know if it's minimum viable, but I do think it's like a very under leveraged part of being a manager.
Yeah. I think I definitely found that really useful when we did that at GitHub. And I definitely think like, I guess in my mind, at least some of that would like maybe fall under kind of getting and providing context. Like I
Yeah,
think
context. Yeah.
I've written
Yeah.
the piece probably from more of a, because it's all I've ever done, mindset of like a smaller organization, right? So like the
Yeah. So there
first
isn't that
organization.
much of an org chart, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like,
Yeah.
so it's probably obvious to people a little bit more like who they should know. But I think the interesting thing about that is I think something that you and I were both very good at, and I think we shared this with each other when we were a manager, but I think we also shared this with a bunch of other people in the wider team, was like that idea of just being like, you and I would both just like sit in a lot of, well, Slack channels and maybe you'll be on some calls or documents or GitHub issues or whatever, and just almost like absorb the information so that later on when someone on the team is like, why is this person doing that?
Yes.
We're like, oh, I
Yeah.
have the answer for you actually on that because I've
Yeah.
just read all this stuff
Yeah.
with the anticipation that at some point in the future, someone will need to know some of this stuff.
I think also, like, especially if you're working with really high level folks, um, like, our conversations weren't always about, like, this full structure, right? Because as you get more and more advanced, you don't need to. You are not just a staff engineer under me, you're also principal, right? And uh, it once I became a director, it dawned on me that, like, I needed to have opinions about things. And, like, those opinions wouldn't necessarily I was so used to just being asked and then trying to form my opinion, and I needed to get ahead of it, and I needed to establish my own opinions. So what you and I would talk about a lot in our conversations would be, "Okay, cool, this thing is going on. It's not bad yet. We don't need to interject. What do we think?" Right? And, like, I wanted your input, and your input wouldn't become my opinion, it would just be input, and I would share my perspective, and, like, we could influence each other, and we could try to grow each other as we started to make assessments about what was going on, why, and then, like, eventually, like, "Hey, do we want what do we need to see to take action?" I think the other part of that I think is really interesting is that we're a team. And we're tag teaming together and we're like negotiating, okay, cool, who goes first? Oh, actually, they might like receive you better or they might receive me better. And it's not about like, of course, we're like, oh, well, technically the principal engineer should weigh in here. Technically, the director should lead here. But it was always a consideration and it wasn't like a rule. And it wasn't about who wanted the most credit. It was about the outcome and how do we influence it.
Yeah, I think that's something that again you and I shared there, which was good. Is like we both cared more about the outcome than who got the credit, right? And I also think like in my mind with one-on-ones and like manager managee relationships or whatever, like ideally it's always like a two-way influence thing, right? And it's a
Yeah.
two-way feedback thing and it's a two-way collaboration thing. Like, and it's obviously sometimes it's going to be need to be a little bit of like command and control or whatever, but like that you want to minimize that stuff, right? And I think something else that um you and I were both, in my opinion, reasonably good at, or like at least aspired for, which is not always super common, is that expression of like servant leadership, right?
Yeah.
Of
Yeah. Yeah.
if there's like shit work to be done, if there's like maybe a little bit of a boring task or a difficult conversation, or someone has to be the bad guy or whatever, then it's like you or I would often sign up for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think in a funny way as well, that comes back to establishing connections, right? Because I guess one way of looking at it is the way you mentioned it before with the establishing connections of like, hey, you should go and meet with this person, whatever. But you're also building connections with the people in your team, the people you're reporting to, the people who, the people who are your manager, and you build
Yeah.
those connections and those trust often, I think, through vulnerability, through like being willing to be a servant leader rather than being like, I can get away with this, but I'm in charge and you can't. So nah, nah.
Yeah, I think it's like, I've always thought about like, uh, servant leadership has such a bad connotation with it in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Especially with like the movement of founder mode and blah blah blah. And like I think the way that you defined it was really good. Where it's not all that like crazy and like about sacrificing and like being a martyr. It's just about getting in the trenches with people
Yep.
and like and being really honest about what you deliver, right? I remember when I became a director, um, which is where we met, right? Um, it was over a team that I had never worked with before. And like, of course, we all knew each other by reputation, but it was like terrifying for me, right? Because I was like, why would these people want to work with me? We had, one of my favorite people in the world, Derek, right? Who was already a very respected leader. And like, who am I to come in? And then obviously I got, not obviously, but, I got told that I would be the directly responsible individual of this product that I hadn't even played with that much and I didn't really know much about. And I had to all of a sudden become in charge. And it was like instant organ rejection from the team. And what I had to do, which luckily was my instinct to do, it wasn't like I had to change my personality or what I wanted to do, was like, okay, cool. Let me be really clear about what I offer, right? I'm the only one who's in those leadership rooms. I need to represent your opinions. And then I need to come back and I need to tell you what their feedback is. My job is to give you the best possible feedback, to argue back with them, to minimize the work that you need to do, and to be as honest as possible so you can do your work. Everyone just wants to do the best work that they possibly can and they want to feel proud of what they do. And like being able to articulate what I offer and not do more than that, I think is like part of servant leadership. And I also think it's about bringing people in, right? So it's like, did I want to be in those meetings alone? Absolutely not, right? Like, that is terrifying to be representing every single decision when you don't even know what happened. And so I immediately started my mission on trying to bring people in as quickly as possible. I feel like part of servant leadership is sharing that credit. And especially if you're the default leader, you should be stepping out of the limelight as soon as it's effective, right? Yeah. That's my opinion. There was
I,
something else you said, which was like, oh, sometimes it's like not about command and control. Sometimes the best thing you can do as in servant leadership is to take over and help people out of a jam as well. But it's probably like a 5% likelihood versus like the 95% is to be in the trenches.
well, I think like what I like about your framing is that idea of almost making, I guess, to maybe jump into engineer speak, like making explicit like what your interface is, like
Yes,
what your
yes,
responsibilities
yes.
are,
Yeah.
like
Yeah, here are my endpoints.
yeah, and I think that's I think like making things explicit is so if you combine making things explicit, which include things that might not make you look good, right? So something I'm enjoying about the fractional CTO work right now is the fact that I am fractional means that like I don't know a lot of stuff a lot of the time, right? So
Right.
like a lot of the time I'm trying to drive a decision without a strong preference of what that decision is, but I'm just
Yeah.
like I just want clarity, right? And I
Yeah.
do that a different way sometimes. Sometimes I do that by asking questions, and sometimes I do that by being like, I think we should do X, right? And then the entire room erupts, and I'm like, great, we're not doing X anymore, right? Like, you've all
Yeah.
explained to me why we don't do that. But like, if I had asked you, like, what do you think about X, there may have been crickets. But if I say we're going to do it, then I get a reaction, and then I can respond and iterate and change on that reaction. And I just think like stuff like admitting you don't know, being willing to change your mind, like all this stuff that and maybe I don't know if that's part of servant leadership per se, but I think there's a lot of stuff that is like viewed as maybe like weakness, and you need to show
Yes.
strong leadership, but actually it's kind of the other way around. Like actually, that it shows a lot more confidence and strength in some ways in leadership to be able to be honest about when you don't know things.
Yes. I actually think that like, something that I'm always trying to do in meetings is think, okay, cool. Um, what is information that's like not explicit right now and like to call that out. And then the opposite is like, okay, if I'm confused, there might be other people in the room confused. You have to weigh it, right? Like you don't want to like make the whole meeting about you. But sometimes if I ever get a DM where someone's like, "Hey, what's going on?" I will always ask that question. And like I'll always be the one, well, I'll always try to be the one who's vulnerable first and like willing to look a little bit stupid. And I think you're absolutely right. That actually is, you have to be extremely confident to ask questions, and you can role model that, right? You can role model this like curiosity and like to be willing to switch up the conversation. I think the other thing that you said is like, sometimes people are in a deadlock for a decision and you just need to give them something to react to. And if they do that, what you're saying is you're willing for people to yell at you in the name of progress, right? And like it's about like a good argument, and you're like willing to say, okay, cool, let's start a good argument. And if it means the entire room is just yelling at you and telling you why, you're like, great, we've learned A, B, and C, and like now we have a path forward. And like no one's gonna say thank you, but like you're welcome, right?
Yeah, I also love the idea of like a good argument or constructive conflict or all that type of thing. But what does that look like to you? What's a good argument or conflict or bad argument or conflict?
So I got this philosophy from Pivotal, the company I worked at before GitHub, which is like, and it's not, I don't think it's invented by them, but like we talked about it a lot. And it's like this concept of a balanced team, right? And so at Pivotal, we had um, every team had an engineer and or an engineering lead, a product lead, and a designer lead. And we always said that like this is our balanced team because we had to represent three personas, right? The technology, the user, and the business. And the thing is that like if we all thought the exact same thing, we wouldn't have a better outcome. We kind of need to argue with each other, and we kind of need to represent different sides sometimes in order for us to figure out the best compromise. And if you have people that you can argue with really well, I had like a product counterpart, Billy Griffin, when we were working on desktop and CLI. Um, I knew that if he had a different perspective, that he and I could argue about it extremely respectfully in order to figure out the context that we're missing on each other's side. And once we had all of our cards on the table, um, we could make a decision together. And like uh, arguing is about saying, hey, I think that there is really important information that we need to incorporate before we make the outcome. Even if it is we don't change anything and we're just willing to accept those risks, let's like have that dialogue, right? Um, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it. I guess your example with Billy is like the classic argument, right? Like
Right.
the
Product eng.
product and engineering. And I've
Yeah.
always thought this, like, is that I've seen it go problematic in both directions, right? Where engineering is like, no, we know best. Like products are just, doing what they do always, and like we're not going to listen to them. We know the customer or whatever. When they don't, and they're not sometimes asking themselves in this situation, like, do you want to sit on 10 customer calls this month, right, and review their feedback? I mean, some engineers do, great, right? Like, but most engineers don't. Like,
Yeah.
so can you lean on the product person to do that? But then the other extreme sometimes where engineers become utterly 100% deferential to product
Ugh,
and
yes, people.
yeah.
Yes.
Well, I mean, sometimes I think it's even like a power confusion thing, right? Where
Mm,
it's some teams in some engineering cultures or whatever, it's like the product manager is kind of like the manager who decides what gets worked on by who and when, right? And then sometimes you get engineers who are like, but I don't agree, or but my product manager won't let me work on tech debt. And like, it's maybe a little blunt, but I guess that's my vibe. But my approach, I've said it almost every company I've worked at or every team I've worked at has been, okay, engineer, like look in the org chart and tell me where between you and the CEO is a product manager. And almost always the answer is, oh, there's not. Like products are in their own area over there. It's like, well, that should tell you something. And that thing is that like you're an engineer. You were hired to do engineering. Like you need to collaborate with product, right? But it's a collaboration. And that doesn't mean just doing what you're told. And it also doesn't mean refusing to give any ground because you control the pull requests, right? Like it needs to be somewhere in the happy middle ground. And
yeah.
I guess, yeah, there's a time I think of where at GitHub, one of my favorite ones was like a PM who'd like given me a nice rank ordered list of what needed to be worked on. And I worked on item 1, then 2, then item like 15. And they were like, why did you work on item 15? And I was like, well, because the code was right next to item 2. it took me 20 minutes. And if I worked on it in order, next time I come around, it's going to take me like 4 hours, right? And
Yeah.
then they were
Yeah.
like, oh,
Yeah.
that makes total sense now, right? But like, I was not wrong to not follow the list, and they were not
Right.
wrong to not call me on it, right? Like
Right.
that's completely reasonable. But we had that conversation, and I guess you could maybe say an argument about it, and then both of us left with, to use your point from earlier, like more information and more context
Right.
and whatever.
And like, I think that, I think a lot of people, when they enter into tech especially, are not comfortable with that conversation, right? Like they could feel like, hey, I did the right thing, and then my PM dares to question me on like what I did. I don't need to explain myself. Like you need to trust me. And I think that like where that ego comes in about like not feeling trusted versus like finding the root of curiosity. Um, I think that it gets hard when like people are, new to the conversation, new to those arguments, maybe have a little bit of ego or a chip on their shoulder, or that like, you know, those are sometimes things that you can't control depending on who you work with. The one thing that you have control over is phrasing your question in a curious way. And like the art of phrasing a question in a curious way to be like, hey, I noticed. Can you tell me a little bit more about, right? Instead of being like, why the fuck would you do that, right? It kind of changes the dialogue a lot. I think the other thing that this reminds me of is I don't know if you remember, but our first conversations um, had a different dynamic where you were very complimentary of some of the things that I was doing. And I was like, I hate this. Like, please never kiss my ass again. And I was like, what I want is someone who can argue back with me. Right. And like, I think that most of my best relationships are people who are willing to argue back. And so I was kind of curious from your perspective, if you're willing to share, like how you interpreted, like, especially now after we like have worked together for 3 years, what do I really mean when I say I want people to argue back with me? And like, um, you know, what is that art of the argument when it comes to like a manager and a report relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it meant to me at least is like everything is a negotiation, and even if you state something as, I guess to go back to earlier, right, like the kind of command and control thing, is that like I think the thing that was helpful is I think you and I both had an idea of like we will just tell the other person what to do sometimes, with the
Hmm.
understanding that if that person thinks it's a stupid idea, they're going to be
Yes.
like, I'm going to tell you why I'm not going to do that, or why we should do something
Yes.
differently, or
Yes.
whatever, right? And I think that saves a lot of time in some ways, rather, and
Yeah.
in some ways, even like the ass kissing you mentioned at the beginning, right? Like some of that was like, new manager, don't know her super well. Like I'm going to
Yeah.
figure out like how this goes, and I generally default to like, I'm going to like be nice, polite, friendly, Mike, to begin with, right? And then we're going to see how much you can handle of the like pushback and the critique and whatever, right? And I think we both did that, which is great. Like one of the things I was actually talking about you to someone in current company yesterday, where I was talking about like the levels of feedback, right? Where you were always great at giving me feedback. I think I always solicited a lot of feedback. I remember every time at GitHub, the performance review process was like 100 was like, yeah, fine, good job, whatever. 200 was like, oh my goodness, you've recreated the universe, like you're
You invented
unbelievable.
nylon.
Yeah, exactly. You're unbelievably incredible.
Yeah.
And my view was, if I ever get less than 200 in a report, which was all of them, then I want constructive criticism on how I can improve. And that blew some people's minds because they're like, oh, but is that not going to make you feel sad? And I'm like, no, it makes me feel sad to not get told how I can improve. And
Yeah.
one of the things I
Yeah.
loved the most was like, so initially, you would give me feedback, and then we had almost like two levels of what I would call like unfair feedback, right? So level one was like, okay, I'm going to give you feedback on something where I never told you, no one ever told you,
Yeah.
but ideally you would have known that this was the right thing to do
Mhm.
without
Mhm.
anyone ever
Mhm.
telling you,
Yeah.
just based on your gut. And then
Yeah.
level two of unfair feedback, which we only got to right at the end of our working relationship, which I kind of loved, was like, I actually told you to do something. I was wrong to tell you to
Yeah.
do that. You should
Oh
have
yeah.
refused and pushed back and done it your way. And as a result, unfortunately, like you can't get, the top performance rating or bonus or whatever on this project because the outcome, like you did exactly what you were told. but the outcome was not
Didn't work.
optimal, and
Yeah.
therefore, like, you're at the level where you're being judged on your outcomes and not based on did you just do what you were told, right? And that, to me, that takes a huge amount of trust between two
It
people to
does.
be able to
It
deliver
does.
that. And like that's for me almost like the so far like max level of like delivering feedback when you can say that and when I can take that on the chin and be like, yeah, that's fair. I'm gonna adjust going forward and whatever. But you also know that you can, because I'm sure you had other people that you've managed over the years who you knew you couldn't say that to them because that would
No,
either,
absolutely not. Because you have to be, like, comfortable with, like, okay, the outcome was the outcome. We both agreed that the outcome wasn't good, and, like, we're both here to do the analysis together, and, like, I think that, also some people are like, "Cool, well, for Neha, like, I'm getting a hit on my score, whereas Neha getting a hit on her score, and, like, the system's unfair,
yeah,
right? My
yeah,
manager may or may not have visibility into it. My manager may or may not care. And like there's different responsibilities at different levels, and you may not get the retribution that you want. And like that it is what it is, right? And so if you can kind of be like, okay, cool, it is what it is. I'm willing to take a look at like the outcomes and like truly understand what we can do differently, then you have a really rich conversation. I think also part of those unfair conversations was like, I tried to always be like, this was out of your control. And it affected the outcome. And therefore, this is the score. And like you just have to be okay with things that are out of your control and then focus on what's in your control, even if it's a tiny slice, right?
yep. I guess if anyone's listening and worrying, I also think that that's obviously very reflective of your seniority, right? Like if you're a
Yeah.
more junior
Yeah.
engineer, like you're not going to be held responsible for stuff outside of your control. But when
Oh, of
like
course not.
if you're a principal engineer, distinguished engineer, staff engineer, maybe depending on the company, like yeah, like
It's
you're
almost exclusively that.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, the feedback absolutely changes as you go up the ranks as well. And like as I go up the ranks, right, depending on my level and then my reports level, both of those feedback changes a lot. I want to have that again. I want to like be able to have those like really intense feedback conversations. I think I only hit that with like 4 or 5 people.
Well, I'm sure you'll get there again. Do you have
Yeah.
any almost like final stuff you want to tell people where they can find you on the internet or what you're doing or any of that stuff?
Oh, well, I left GitHub a month ago, so the closest you can do is probably find me on LinkedIn. I'm Neha Batra. I haven't started posting anywhere yet. So you'll probably have to wait a little bit longer, but I'm trying to start. Oh, actually, I did a lot of article writing on lead dev. So if you go to leaddev.com and find me, Neha Batra, you can find some of like my philosophies and I don't know, hopefully I'll start writing again soon. What about
Awesome.
you?
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm doing solo consulting stuff. I'm doing a bit of fractional CTO work. Like I do writing on my blog at McQuaid.com. And yeah, if people want me to write for them, talk to them, do some fractional CTO work or consulting stuff or whatever, then that's the best way to get in touch.
Oh,
So yeah,
and like if you are listening to this podcast and you're like, I really want to hear the two of you talk about something, like reach out and tell us, and like maybe we'll incorporate that into another round if people like this.
100%.
Yeah.
Thanks, Neha. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye.